You got it.
Okay. Hey, everybody. Just letting folks trickle in here, and then we will get started. Give it one more minute. All right. Well, welcome everyone to our second session of our clinician education series. Today we're going to talk about the science of cannabinoids and sleep. Should be a fun one. Going to cover mechanisms, clinical evidence, and practical integration. I'm Marcel, Chief Scientific Officer at Charlotte's Web. Let's kick it off. Just wanted to remind everybody that this session's being recorded. We'll be passing the recording around following the session. Q&A will be at the end. I'm going to focus on the beginning part on kind of give you an unbiased, true read of where the literature is on cannabinoids and sleep. Then I'm going to pass it over to Ivory Swirsky, who's our head of medical affairs, to talk a little bit about the product side. And then, yeah, we have time for Q&A. So looking forward to it. I'm, as I said, Marcel Bon-Miller. My background is in cannabinoid research. My PhD is in clinical psychology. I've been doing cannabinoid work for 20 some odd years now. Have been at Charlotte's Web for about 3.5. Before that, I was at a company called Canopy Growth Corporation. And in my role at Charlotte's Web, I'm involved in everything from product development and formulation to research that we have that's ongoing on a number of different areas on the cannabinoid side. So I've been publishing and continue to publish a lot of the work on minor cannabinoids. Have done a bit of work on sleep, which we'll talk about in this. So yeah, really excited to delve in. Our learning objectives for today are fivefold. So first, about endocannabinoid pharmacology for sleep, really talking about the involvement of CB1 or cannabinoid receptor 1 in the sleep-wake cycle with REM and non-REM modulation. Also going to talk a bit about THC and CBD as the evidence anchors. This is where most of the work has happened and where some indications we know the most about. Then I'm going to talk about CBN as the emerging cannabinoid. This is where a lot of folks have been focusing their attention, including us, from a research perspective. So I'll talk a little bit about what we know. Talk a bit about dosing, timing, and route of administration, kind of the importance of taking these into account, pharmacokinetic differences as a function of dosing, and some questions about tolerance. And then closing it off, really talking about practical integration across disciplines. So really helping each provider, depending on where you're coming from, whether it's chiropractor, massage therapist, physician, what should you be thinking about in terms of drug-drug interactions, older adult considerations, and integration into with sleep hygiene and other behavioral approaches. So starting off with the endocannabinoid pharmacology for sleep. really the endocannabinoid system is very involved in the sleep-wake cycle and sleep-wake regulation. The endocannabinoid system acts through a few different mechanisms. One, there's endogenous ligands that promote sleep. So anandamide and 2-AG, those are both endocannabinoids. They promote non-REM and REM sleep through CB1 or cannabinoid receptor 1. This has been a target for insomnia. We'll talk a little bit about where the data fall there. CB1 signaling stabilizes non-REM sleep. So there's been some preclinical work here that's used polysomnography, showing that showing CB1 signaling supporting sleep continuity, but not being required for sleep homeostasis. Important to know that endocannabinoid tone follows a daily cycle. So circulating levels of endocannabinoids, 2-AG, for example, shows large circadian variation. And so important to sort of think about this as not a static system, but a system that really adapts and is dynamic throughout the day. What does this mean clinically? Really, REM suppression happens with CB1 agonism. So what does that mean? Sort of, it's a mouthful, but really means that smoked cannabis and oral THC reduce REM sleep. So we'll talk a little bit about that. You might think this is not a good thing. For some populations, this actually is a good thing, and we'll talk about that, for example, with PTSD and nightmares. Sleep continuity is definitely a target, and because of the CB1 signaling stabilizing non-REM bouts, it could mean fewer awakenings rather than faster sleep onset, which we'll talk about within the context of CBN and how that works. And mechanisms differ. There are some like CBD, which we'll talk a little bit about. It doesn't act directly on the cannabinoid system in the traditional way that THC does, but it acts indirectly. So some of these cannabinoids like CBD work on serotonin, for example, and other systems that may help reduce or promote improvements in secondaries like anxiety, pain, which then flow through to improvements in sleep. So it's a mouthful, it's a lot, but the endocannabinoid system is definitely the point here, I guess, is that it's really central to the sleep cycle. And a lot of these cannabinoids interact directly and some outside of the endocannabinoid system to help regulate the sleep-wake cycle. So for each individual cannabinoid, I'll just kind of go through the main ones that are talked about in the sleep literature. THC, right, this is the primary cannabinoid in cannabis. This is what's responsible for intoxication stemming from cannabis, particularly at higher doses. It's a partial agonist at CB1, so that cannabinoid receptor 1 in your body. It can be sedating at low to moderate doses. When we're saying low to moderate doses, we're talking about 2.5 to 10 milligrams or so of THC. You get sedation effects. In terms of sleep architecture, what THC does is it reduces REM and it reduces sleep onset latency. And again, we'll talk about, so it helps you fall asleep faster and it reduces REM, which we'll talk about in the PTSD side shortly. And there's some RCTs that have shown, so randomized controlled trials that have shown this, as well as open label studies, as well as real world evidence. CBD's effect on sleep is less direct. Like I was saying, it's really about CBD's impact on other symptoms that an individual is experiencing, and those symptoms then have that impact on sleep. So CBD improves anxiety, which then can lead to improvements in sleep, right? If you have trouble falling asleep because your mind's racing, you're thinking about what's going on the next day, this is where CBD could be helpful. Again, very little direct impact of CBD on sleep architecture, but a number of studies have showing this indirect link through serotonin and other mechanisms that improve pain, improve anxiety, et cetera. And again, randomized controlled trials, open label studies, as well as real world evidence have shown this. CBN This is the kind of newer cannabinoid that people have been focusing on. It is much weaker. It does interact with CB1, but it's much weaker of an agonist than THC, about 10 or so fold. Um, we're still trying to figure out exactly all the different ways that CBN works, but think of it as a much, much weaker THC is one way to think about it, though we haven't really seen from the evidence any intoxication associated with CBN up to pretty high doses. Um, in terms of sleep architecture, kind of the main findings are that it reduces awakenings throughout the night. And I'll get into that. But we still haven't been any published studies with objective sleep outcomes like polysomnography or actigraphy. There are two large RCTs, one of which I was involved in supporting these findings. Outside of those three main cannabinoids, nabilone, which is a synthetic sort of analog of THC, also a CB1 and CB2 agonist, has similarly to THC shown REM suppression, which underlies nightmare reduction. So think of some of the nabilone findings and the THC findings can kind of be, they're very complementary to each other because both work in very similar ways. And then finally, there's some terpene data. So terpenes, occurring in cannabis, terpenes are responsible for the flavor, the smell of cannabis or hemp. And terpenes like myrcene or linalool have been shown to improve some sleep outcomes in combination with a cannabinoid. There haven't been really any work that's looked at terpenes individually on sleep outcomes, but there have been some studies that have looked at, or one study that has looked at CBD plus terpenes and the impact of those terpenes on sleep outcomes. So an important part of this. So let's get into, I know it was a lot getting into just jumping right into the endocannabinoid system and a little bit about what each of these cannabinoids are. Now I'm going to kind of break down where each of the evidence lies. And really, like I said in the beginning, THC and CBD are the evidence anchors. Most of the work has happened on THC and CBD historically, and those include randomized controlled trials, open label studies, real world evidence. I'm going to start with reviews. There's a couple reviews, few reviews that have been done on cannabinoids and sleep. And there's, of course, limitations to reviews. The biggest limitation is that this literature is evolving very quickly. And so, these reviews published in 2021, 2022, they are already outdated in a lot of ways. The CBN studies that we'll talk about later occurred in 2024. So, of course, we're not part of these reviews. And a lot of reviews focus on either pharmaceutical preparations like nabiximols, which we'll talk about in a second, or nabilone, the synthetic THC analog. But in general, kind of looking across this primarily heavy THC literature, Wang and colleagues, this was in BMJ, British Medical Journal, in 2021 showed a 6% increase in the proportion of patients achieving the minimally important difference in sleep quality versus placebo. That means essentially fancy way of saying individuals taking cannabis, sort of broadly speaking, had better sleep outcomes relative to placebo, about 6% better. There's other reviews that have looked at, so this Bilbao and colleagues 2022 highlighted nabiximols. This is trade name Sativex. This is a combination sort of one-to-one of THC and CBD, showing some improvements in sleep there. And then there's another review that looked at 31 studies showing that sleep improved in 7 of 19 randomized controlled trials and 7 of 12 uncontrolled trials. Most promising in certain subsets, so individuals with pain-related disorders, with no real impact on sleep in healthy participants. No big differences were seen between THC and CBD. While some individuals were reporting a lot of the differences that we're seeing were subjective, there wasn't a lot showing sleep architecture change. Again, I wouldn't put a ton of stock into these reviews at this point because, again, a lot of literature has changed since then, even though this is only 4 years ago, 5 years ago. And we know a bit more even now than we did then. So I'll delve into sort of exactly what we do know. So for THC and sleep, what we know is that THC facilitates sleep onset. This has been shown with acute administration of cannabis. What it does is it reduces the time it takes to fall asleep. Pretty simple as that. And it also increases slow wave or stage 4 sleep. We also know that THC reduces REM sleep. And this has been done in both smoked cannabis and oral THC studies in showing pretty consistently that it reduces REM. It's a reliable effect. We know that it's because of the agonism of CB1, so that cannabinoid receptor 1 in the endocannabinoid system. And it's a mechanistic basis for nightmare reduction among individuals with PTSD, which we'll talk about shortly. We also know that THC can improve overall subjective sleep quality. This has been across a number of different randomized, open label, and real world studies. It's most consistent in patients with sleep that's disrupted by pain. And part of that may be because THC helps reduce pain, right? So again, thinking about direct and indirect effects, THC helping reduce onset latency, so speed up time to fall asleep, reducing REM during the night, which can be helpful for individuals that have nightmares, and can reduce pain, which then improves sleep outcomes among those that have disrupted sleep because of pain. That said, there are some caveats that are important to note here. One is that withdrawal disrupts sleep. Difficulty sleeping and strange and vivid dreams are among the most constantly reported withdrawal symptoms from THC. So if you're using THC, you've been using THC for a long time, just like anything. If you use caffeine and you stop using caffeine, individuals report headaches because it has withdrawal. And THC is one of the cannabinoids. Not all cannabinoids have dependence potential where you have withdrawal, craving, tolerance, etc. THC is one. And so it's important to use as low of a dose as possible to be able to get those effects. But when you've discontinued using THC, it can mess your sleep up. And strange dreams are one of the longest lasting withdrawal symptoms of THC. So really important to know, if you have somebody that's using THC for sleep, maybe they're escalating their dose, or maybe it's individuals that have been using a high level of THC for quite some time, know that if you have them stop using THC, even if you taper it down, you're going to start getting withdrawal symptoms that negatively impact sleep. The other thing is REM suppression is double-edged, right? Therapeutic in PTSD, but chronic REM suppression in other populations might not be the best thing. So really about picking THC for the population that it is most beneficial for, and those REM effects may be specific to PTSD. And dose-dependent next-day effects are another thing that's important to know. The higher doses that you use of THC, the more likely you are to have next-day negative consequences. So more is not better with THC and sleep. It's really about finding the minimally effective dose. And that can be, we'll talk a little bit more about dosing, but that could be 2.5 to 5 milligrams. Once you start getting up, if you're 10 milligrams, 15 milligrams, 20 milligrams of THC, you could have next day effects, right? And those, you don't want sedation, you don't want dizziness or other effects that hang over till the next day. And there's technological ways of dealing with this as well, but sort of speeding up the time that THC is kind of into and out of your body. Ivory will talk a little bit about that on the back end, but these are a few ways of dealing with it, but in general, these are some words of caution, right? So THC seems to be really helpful for sleep onset, also reducing REM, only want it for certain populations, right? And helps with pain, particularly helps with sleep among those with co-occurring pain problems because of its effect on pain. CBD, it's a different story. It's really mostly an indirect effect for CBD. There have been a number of studies that have looked at sort of more complex populations, if you will. So Capano et al. Were looking at individuals on opioid therapy, and they showed that adding sort of full spectrum CBD-rich hemp extract improved sleep outcomes. Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index is the sort of gold standard, or one of the gold standard sleep measures. So over 8 weeks, these individuals that were taking sort of a full spectrum hemp had improved sleep outcomes, but it was among individuals that had chronic pain and were using opioid therapy, right? So again, CBD helping with pain. And it's not just CBD in this full spectrum. There were small amounts of THC in there, CBD impacting pain and then improving outcomes. Same thing in anxiety. So there's studies that have looked at full spectrum, sort of high CBD, very small amounts of THC, hemp in anxiety populations, and have seen, again, improvements in sleep. Important to know if you're using, in those first two, examples, we're using full spectrum, right? So this is cannabis or hemp that has CBD, but also has small amounts of THC, has other cannabinoids, CBG, CBC, I could name all sorts of, and also terpenes. If you use pure CBD, so isolated, think CBD isolate, so purified CBD, it's one sort of note is that the dose response may be nonlinear. We don't see this in full spectrum. We haven't really seen this or looked much into it in broad spectrum, but with isolate, it seems to be, with certain indications like anxiety, an inverted U-shaped dose response curve. And it's a mouthful, but what it really means is that more is not always better. You kind of want to increase your dose until you find a sweet spot where it works. If you keep going, it actually works less effectively. And so that kind of inverted U, there's a sweet spot where you want to target from a dosing perspective. Important to know if you're using isolate for, co-occurring issues with sleep, like anxiety. Because with anxiety, we found that, there is an effective dose. And then if you go too high, not high enough, you won't get that anxiety reduction. And then thus you're less likely to have that sleep impact. So how to frame it for patients. CBD is not a sedative hypnotic. This is not going to help you fall asleep like zolpidem or benzodiazepine. So don't expect, take CBD and it's going to knock you out. Really, it's about giving it to individuals that, like I said, where sleep disruption is driven by pain, anxiety, rumination, or other sorts of co-occurring indications. And it's not going to work. CBD is not going to work the first night you take it. It's something that you have to let build up in your system to get to steady state, if you will. So you want to take it regularly, but you don't expect with using CBD that it's necessarily going to all of a sudden be fixed in night one. THC, on the other hand, you'll get those sleep induction effects, some of that REM suppression pretty early on. CBD, it has to build up in your system a bit. Nightmares. So this is an area that I've done a bit of work on in the sort of PTSD realm. And this literature is pretty consistent. It's pretty cool. There's a few different studies that have been done. The most recent of which was in 2015, so almost 10 years ago now. There's some follow-up ones that are happening as we speak. But a few different designs, from randomized double-blind placebo-controlled in the Jetley study to open label to retrospective, as you see a few different designs here. All of them used either THC or nabilone. Again, nabilone being a synthetic analog of THC. You see the doses are pretty low. 5 milligrams, 4 milligrams, a little up to 3 milligrams. We're not talking about huge amounts of THC that are needed, but in all of them, we saw, these authors saw significant improvements in nightmares and insomnia among individuals with PTSD. So pretty cool, pretty consistent, bunch of different groups over, a 6-year span or so. And it's, definitely for individuals with PTSD, THC or nabilone seems to be pretty promising, and likely why a lot of people with PTSD gravitate towards THC, using cannabis is because of those improvements in sleep. Hyperarousal symptoms, which sleep is part of, are one of the main cluster of symptoms of PTSD that are improved following the use of cannabis or high THC products. CBN, this is also near and dear to my heart because we did the first study of CBN and sort of first properly controlled study of CBN and sleep. This study, which I'll talk about at the first, give you some details on this. This was a study looking at almost 300 adults, about 18 to 55. Here we focused just on self-reported sleep, and it was really over the course of a week that individuals used CBN, because we're really looking to see if CBN could improve sleep outcomes. There's been a lot of anecdotal work. CBN, how it's formed is actually it's a degradation product of THC. I talked earlier about how it's much weaker, about 10-fold weaker in its activity at CB1 relative to THC. It is a degradant. So essentially what happens is if you have cannabis, you have THC in cannabis or hemp, THC at low amounts in hemp. When it sits around, it's exposed to oxygen, it's exposed to sort of ambient temperature, light. It will degrade. THC will start dropping. Those levels of THC will stop dropping. It doesn't disappear into the atmosphere. It converts into CBN. And so CBN is technically a degradant of THC. And a lot of people who were using, I think of my favorite story, I think of this is the anecdotal evidence that led to the trial is I was in Australia and I was sitting down with a number of folks in the cannabis space. And there was a guy there that was talking about how he ages cannabis. He takes cannabis and he has a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old, made me think of whiskey, these sort of older and aged cannabises. And as they got older, he had certain ones that were amazing for sleep. And he was talking about how great these old strains of cannabis were. That's because that THC converted to CBN, right? The longer it stayed around. And really what he was talking about was CBN was helping his sleep. And so anyhow, there are lots of these anecdotal stories. Hadn't been a clinical trial. We said we need to do it. And so I picked a dose, 20 milligrams of CBN by itself, and then also looked at CBN in combination with CBD. I thought, and because a lot of products that were out on the market at the time, that CBD was going to sort of help CBN. They were going to be partners in this equation, and CBD was going to really bolster the effects of CBN. So we'll look at CBN alone, and then a few different amounts of CBD, 10 milligrams, 20 milligrams, and 100 milligrams of CBD. Like I said, people used for a week. And we looked at a number of different self-reported sleep outcomes. And the important finding really was that CBN alone at 20 milligrams improved overall sleep disturbance, which is a sort of a big finding. That's, overall, like you think sleep quality is one part of this, sleep disturbance is sort of like overall sleep problems, if you will. CBN improved that. But then when you drilled into it, specifically, it was number of awakenings. So people that used CBN were less likely to wake up throughout the night relative to placebo. The other interesting finding was that when you add CBD, it didn't help. It actually not only didn't help, it took away the effects of CBN. So it's not just, hey, it's just sitting there as a silent partner. It actually detracted, it kind of butted up against and detracted from those findings, those effects of CBN. And so when you think about from a product perspective, it's not just, oh, well, you could add CBD to CBN. It's like you don't want it. You want CBN alone. Because when you add CBD, it dampens the effects that CBN has on sleep. But take-home finding, CBN reduces nighttime awakenings. Another study came out shortly thereafter, looked similarly at CBN. In this case, it looked at different amounts of CBN, no CBD, just 25 milligrams of CBN, 50, 100, and then a placebo. Then they also put melatonin in, which is kind of cool. They put 4 milligrams of melatonin in to see if there was a difference between CBN and melatonin. Similar measures that we used in our study. And the findings were that all three doses, 25, 50, and 100, all produced improvements in sleep outcomes. There was no difference between CBN and melatonin, which is kind of interesting. And now, important to state this carefully, right, is that just because there wasn't a detected difference doesn't mean that they're the same. But it's a decently powered study, right? 200 or so people per arm. Though it wasn't designed to determine a lack of difference, there still wasn't an observed difference between melatonin and CBN. Some milligrams, there was some improvement in stress, but no other real big differences in terms of other outcomes like anxiety, pain, or well-being. So this really seems to be pretty specific to sleep, which is kind of cool. And side effect profile was no different than placebo, which is pretty amazing. A lot of the cannabinoids, THC kind of has its own issues, particularly at higher doses, but for a lot of cannabinoids, the side effect profiles are pretty mild, which you see here. So 2 independent randomized controlled trials, both came out in 2024, over 1,000 participants now. There are more studies that are in the pipeline. No detectable difference from melatonin. Really, the signal is about reduced sleep disturbance overall and reduced nighttime awakening specifically. Great tolerability profile. This doesn't necessarily mean that it's definitely not superior to melatonin. Is it equivalent? We don't know. But I know a lot of people have been moving away from melatonin for a number of reasons. So this is an alternative to consider, particularly, again, if you have problems waking up throughout the night. It hasn't, important, of course, caveat too, is that none of these studies thus far have used objective sleep measures, right? It's all about self-report. This is how I feel. This is when I woke up, et cetera. But we haven't done studies yet with polysomnography. There's one that just completed, so more data to come there. But these studies, mine was 7 nights, the other study was 4 weeks, so pretty short duration. The reason for 7 nights in our study was because we wanted to see if it, a lot of people, if they start using a product that doesn't work within 7 days, they're going to go find something else. And so we thought I was interested in seeing an effect early, and that's what we saw. So dosing, timing, and route of administration, sort of important things to consider when you think about sleep and these different cannabinoids. Of course, there are many different ways that one can take a cannabinoid: oral, like through capsule or a gummy. Typical onset, about 30 to 120 minutes, duration 6 to 8 hours. So typically good to take an oral capsule about 60 to 90 minutes before bed, best suited for sleep maintenance. Overnight coverage, right? When you take something like CBN, you want it to work throughout the night. So oral is a great way to do that. Sublingual, like a tincture, sometimes can work a bit faster because some of it gets absorbed in your oral mucosal. Duration a little bit shorter, 4 to 6 hours or so. You might want to take things that are sublingual, like a tincture, a little bit closer to bedtime. Maybe more helpful for sleep onset, and helpful for individuals that really want specific titration of doses. You could combine them as one possibility. Topical is one where, right, you're not really going to be using it for sleep in and of itself. You're using it for secondary, right? So if you find that topical application on your knee, for example, because you're having knee pain, helps with that knee pain, that can then help to improvements in sleep, right? So that's where you would use it. Topical in and of itself isn't going to help for sleep. It's just going to help offset or reduce those symptoms of other co-occurring conditions that you might have. So from a practical integration standpoint, important, very, very important. You heard the nuance, right? We're talking about, what does THC do? THC helps with sleep onset, right? Falling asleep. And THC helps with reducing REM, nightmares, right? Can also help some with the pain associated with poor sleep with people that have co-occurring chronic pain. CBD, indirect, right? CBD reduces anxiety, reduces pain, which then helps indirectly with sleep outcomes. CBN helps stay asleep, but not falling asleep. So all of this says it's complex, right? Not one thing's, not one product or not one cannabinoid fits all. And it's really important to sit down and be like, where's the issue, right? Is it problems falling asleep, problems staying asleep, early morning wakening, non-restorative sleep? That really depends, and will impact what it is that you want to take for which outcome. The other is start low. It's not about hero doses. Everybody's, oh, more is probably better. It's not the case at all. With CBD, starting in the 10 to 25 milligram range, in CBN, starting in the 20 to 25 milligram range. Those are the doses that were studied. THC, right, start in the 2.5 to 5 milligram range. You don't need to be high. And in fact, in some cases, THC, higher you go, you've got next day effects, right? You have increased likelihood of withdrawal during periods that you're not using. Keep it on the low end. Time the dose to the root, right? If you're using oral, which most people, use 60 to 90 minutes before bed. If you're smoking cannabis, you'd be using that much sooner, much more temporally close to falling asleep, because inhalation is much faster, sublingual kind of falling somewhere in the middle. Use it nightly, not necessarily as needed, because for some of these, like CBD as an example, CBN, you need some time for it to build up in your system. THC is a little bit of an outlier, but still helps to take on a regular basis. For other cannabinoids, definitely, I would say you want to build it up in your system, and don't expect immediate effects. And reassess, right? If there isn't meaningful, give it time, give it 4 weeks or so, take a look, reassess, and then determine whether, dosing should change or whether you got the cannabinoid wrong. And the sleep problem is you don't have the right cannabinoid to sleep problem match. In terms of interactions with sleep medications, really what we're talking about is, and there's some interesting studies that have looked at CYP cocktails, so looking at drug-drug interactions between different CYP inhibiting drugs that interact with your CYP. What I would say is that mostly the issue to worry about is compounded sedative effects. So for example, benzodiazepines and Z drugs, what you're concerned about is additive sedation. And really, and these are all these different mechanisms. CYP3A4 is one piece of this. With the additive sedation, you've got fall risk in older adults as a practical consequence, right? Antidepressants, there's some antidepressants that can be sedating. Again, those are things to worry about. Alcohol, another one, right? And so just think about what else does somebody have on board. At the doses that we're talking about, a lot of the drug-drug interactions that you see with like CBD is probably the worst in terms of drug-drug interactions. THC, a bit less. CBN, we're still figuring out. But for CBD, it interacts with a lot of different medications that one can take. Most of them are pretty mild to moderate interactions. What I will say, since I've got the mic and the stage, is that if an individual is using CBD, really important to watch out for prescription blood thinners. This has nothing to do with the sleep side, but there is sort of the only real risk interaction that you see with CBD use is among individuals taking like warfarin. Those two can interact. CBD can increase the levels of warfarin and lead to some pretty nasty consequences. So very important if you're on a prescription blood thinner to talk to your, generally speaking, for any drug, you want to talk to your physician before taking it, CBD or another cannabinoid. With warfarin or another prescription blood thinner, very important to go hand in hand, or just generally not take CBD if you're on a prescription blood thinner. But what I would say is generally CBD, while it interacts with lots of other drugs, the ones to focus most on with CBD and other cannabinoids is those other sedatives or sedative hypnotics. Older adults. So just a couple quick notes here. So benzodiazepines and Z drugs appear on Beers criteria as potentially inappropriate in older adults because of falls, fractures, cognitive impairment associated with those drugs. So it's important, the way I would think about it in the older adult population is this an alternative, right? Could these certain cannabinoids be an alternative to those benzodiazepines or Z drugs? Um, and I think if you have, a patient population that has sleep disruption from pain, THC, CBD might be very helpful, right? Because it's reducing that pain, which is then helping with those sleep outcomes. Also, again, if you need a realistic or nice alternative to those Beers listed hypnotics, cannabinoids might be worth taking a look at. Similar to everything, start at the low end, avoid stacking sedatives, make sure to review full medication lists, reassess after 4 weeks. All the things that we've talked about. Fall risk is a very important one to watch, particularly as you're doing THC, right, because of its sedative qualities. So check that and follow those. And really, of course, hand in hand, older adults should be working with physicians or other healthcare practitioners as they go through this. So across disciplines, primary care, really important to focus on patient selection, medication review, right? Screening for untreated primary sleep disorders before adding anything. There's a coordination point for PTSD patients, right? Where prescription cannabinoids could be part of this conversation. For behavioral sleep medicine, CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, remains the front line, and I would not replace it with cannabinoids, but it could be used as an adjunct, particularly in individuals that have co-occurring pain, co-occurring anxiety. In the chiropractic and physical therapy side, again, pain is the real point here. Treating the pain topically, right, or orally with cannabinoids, CBD, THC, may be the best way to then impact those sleep outcomes. Massage therapy, sleep, when I was taking a look at the literature, is a main reason you probably see those massage therapists that are on as a common reason why people report seeking body work. So it's really worth discussing beyond the body work, right? You've got somebody coming in. What is their sleep like? Where are their problems that they're having their sleep? And trying to drive them towards an evidence-based cannabinoid or other therapy that is most appropriate for it. And then acupuncture. Insomnia is a big complaint in the acupuncture space. And so, again, looking at cannabinoids as an adjunct, coordinating with other practitioners, again, to manage the potential sedative effects of stacking of drugs is an important way that one could go. So, takeaways, and then I'm going to flip this over. One, sleep signal is real, but modest, I would say, at this point. THC and CBD work through different routes, right? THC directly sedating, REM suppressing, CBD largely indirect. PTSD-related nightmares are the strongest signal that we see for THC. And CBN has now 2 placebo-controlled trials, still no objective data, but pretty solid evidence, I would say. And again, more is coming from some studies that have just recently completed, potentially comparable to melatonin, but reducing nighttime awakenings and overall sleep disturbance without the intoxication, which is kind of a cool part of the CBN side. And timing and characterization beat dose escalation, right? Like do this smartly, really come at it with low, give it time to work, and then reassess. I'd say drop some questions in if there are any questions into the chat. I don't see any yet. but do drop any in. In the meantime, I will pass this over to Ivory to talk sleep products.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Marcel, for that amazing overview of the different cannabinoids and how they play a role in sleep. So today, what I wanted to talk about, just really briefly before we go back to Q&A and make sure that your questions are answered, are the CBD Clinic products that we have that specifically target sleep. Marcel, I don't know if I can control. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So the first product we'll talk about are our Stay Asleep Plus gummies. So as Marcel was talking about earlier, CBN has been shown to help with staying asleep and reducing number of nighttime awakenings throughout the night. So we have a product specifically targeting helping people to stay asleep, and the name really reflects that. So in this product, we have 30 milligrams of CBN in a THC-free formula designed to support sleep continuity and promote sleep throughout the night. So this 30 milligrams of CBN is really sitting between the 20 milligrams in the Bon-Miller study and the 25 and 50 milligrams in the Colberic study. So looking at that, we split the difference of those efficacious doses and targeted 30 milligrams to help patients stay asleep throughout the night. Just as a quick kind of overview of this is a 1 gummy serving. So 1 gummy has that 30 milligrams of CBN. And then we can go to the next slide. Quality sleep gummy. So this gummy is a little bit different than the one I just talked about. This has that 30 milligrams of CBN in it, as well as fast-acting low-dose THC. So as Marcel was talking about how THC can be beneficial for sleep onset, we have THC here in a fast-acting formula so that it can help people who are struggling with that, like winding down at the end of the night, letting go of the stress from the day to be able to fall asleep. And then in this dual action formula, we also have that 30 milligrams of CBN on board, not in a fast acting formula, to help you stay asleep throughout the whole night. So fast acting low dose THC for that sleep onset, and then 30 milligrams of CBN in a non-fast acting format to help you stay asleep throughout the night, that sleep maintenance piece. And just like our Stay Asleep Plus gummy, this is also a 1 gummy serving size. Marcel, we can go to the next slide. Perfect. So sleep summary. What gummy do I use just to break this down like very explicitly for you all? We have the Stay Asleep gummy, which is useful for people who are having trouble staying asleep throughout the night. So they can, for the most part, like fall asleep without difficulty, right? But it's that waking up a million times and then staring at the ceiling throughout the night. That's where Stay Asleep Plus can be really beneficial. This product is also great for people who are sensitive to THC or for people who don't want to use it for various reasons, or maybe it's contraindicated. Again, this product, our Stay Asleep Plus, just has that 30 milligrams of CBN. Looking at quality sleep, this one is really beneficial for people who have both trouble falling asleep and staying asleep. So I'm laying in bed staring at the ceiling for an hour initially, then I fall asleep for a little bit, but I'm up and down a bunch throughout the night. Quality sleep can be really beneficial for that. Again, because we have that dual action, fast acting THC for sleep onset, and then the CBN on board for sleep maintenance and helping you to stay asleep throughout the night. I'll call out here, kind of obvious, but there is THC in this formula. So you want to make sure that patients are not sensitive to THC or that it's not contraindicated, and having that conversation with patients up front. And I believe those are all of my slides for today. If you have any questions about products, want to do a deeper dive into our formulation and the science behind it, do not hesitate to reach out.
Awesome. Thank you, Ivory. Um, so I also have, as this is shared, the references cited for the peer-reviewed articles that we discussed that back up all the things that I talked about, both here and here. And if you want copies of any of these, just let us know, myself or Ivory, and we're more than happy to pass those along. And we'll end here. Just again, if there are any questions, I'm here to answer, or we can leave. Looking at the Q&A.
I know
Don't
a number
see
of you
any.
had submitted some questions when you were registering. So if you have any pieces of those that you don't feel like were addressed yet, feel free to type them into the chat.
Going once.
Can I raise a
Um,
question, Marcel, before we jump?
sure, absolutely.
Um, so one thing that I saw coming in as people were registering was how to describe mechanisms of actions to clients or to patients. Do you have any ideas, and not to put you on the spot too much,
Yeah,
but
no, it's
how would
fine.
you talk about that in a way with someone who doesn't have a scientific background? Like, what's your 60-second kind of elevator pitch descriptor?
Yeah, so what I'd say is for THC, it's a pretty straight story. Mechanism of action is directly through the endocannabinoid system, through specifically the CB1 receptor. So cannabinoid receptor 1 is where we see that impact going through for sleep onset, as well as reduction of REM. With CBD, it's more indirect. It's not about the endocannabinoid system as much as it is around serotonin, for example. CBD is a serotonin agonist, and other mechanisms, trip receptors, for example, that can help with trip receptors on the pain side, serotonin on the anxiety side. Those are some examples of sort of the more indirect relation that goes on with CBD. For CBN, still trying to figure it out a bit. There is a little bit through the cannabinoid receptor 1, but way less than you see with THC. Other mechanisms involved in why specifically staying asleep versus falling asleep, still working on that. Haven't figured that one out yet. It's a great question. Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you taking the time. And again, we'll share this out. And if any other questions come up later, you can reach out to myself, you can reach out to Ivory, and more than happy to answer any other follow-up questions. Hope this was helpful.